Hopefully everyone will get back. And I think we left off right here. So this is, of course, Martin Luther King Jr., famous civil rights leader. And this really shows you the importance of having human figures to show you the scale. Now, it makes sense to have someone like Martin Luther King, monumental scale, especially if it's a public work of art out in public, but also because he's someone who is a legend because of his sacrifice on behalf of a cause that everyone kind of can relate to, civil rights and freedom, ending, racism and everything else. So, making him monumental is a way to honor what he represented, what he stood for, his legacy. And of course, John F. Kennedy, like here's an example of him being human scale. So, making John F. Kennedy human scale in this case, I think is fitting because you have that one-on-one experience. So when you look at your sculptures that you're writing about this weekend, you might think about how scale relates to your work of art. Now, I want to talk briefly about color because I think you guys understand scale pretty well. And of course, we'll keep talking about these subjects. But for now, I want to make a word about light and dark. As engineers, you all know, of course, that, bright white light reflects more, dark colors absorb more light. And many of these sculptures were painted, as some of you pointed out. Here you can see Caesar Augustus painted, and I think I mentioned how kind of hideous they look. Now, they kind of just look bizarre because you're not used to it, but I'm sure they were really, amazing to see them painted because in this case, I think in a lot of ways, people were convinced they are real. That does make them more real and alive. But we're just so used to the convention of sculpture being kind of raw marble or raw kind of granite or iron or whatnot. So do remember that many of these sculptures were painted. But of course, that's a different matter than this question of kind of basic light and dark and how they reflect light and absorb light. So, if you're making a sculpture, you might think about, well, what medium do you use, whether or not you want to get really hot in the sun or if it's indoors or outdoors. And you might think of color as a starting point. Some artists paint on a black background because the colors will bounce and be more bright and poppy. Many start with a white background because it allows you the colors to be as bright as they are without the black kind of enhancing them. So remember that, for instance, you have different ideas about color, right? So why does a bride wear white? Well, it's meant to be pure, right? She's meant to be more visible than the groom. You're not meant to upstage the bride. So, we often have kind of metaphorical associations with color, right? With the symbolism of color. And we're going to go way in depth into this when we get into religion and the use of different colors in religion. But just for now, you think about black and white and all the different reasons why they have different associations and the functionality of each color in terms of heat, in terms of reflectivity, and maybe even as a starting point, right? You can have a whiteboard or a blackboard. But the idea is if you have a whiteboard, you don't want to use a white marker, right? If you have a blackboard, you don't want to use a black marker. So it's all about contrast, having a bare surface that you can kind of write on that's visible, right? Of course, a blackboard might get hotter if you're exposed to sunlight, and a whiteboard might be too reflective and it just like hurts your eyes to look at it. So it really depends on one hand, the functionality, but also in art, maybe there's a certain kind of metaphorical use of color. And you kind of have to get away from, the idea of race. I mean, we can bring that in and we'll do that in a moment, but also kind of free that from your understanding of color for a moment, just kind of look at it on its own terms. But of course, you can play around with ideas of why we have associations with certain colors. So this is a very famous painting that I think plays around, in fact, with those associations. So what are we looking at here? Has anyone seen this painting before? I think someone said no. Okay, cool. So this is the first time. So this is a very famous painting by Norman Rockwell, an artist who's often on the walls of like the doctor's office, the dentist's office. And this is a painting showing the first girl being escorted, African-American girl being escorted to school, I guess, during the time of segregation, the end of segregation. So what we're looking at are four federal officers, escorting her to school, right? And the artist, and we'll look at this painting again later in the semester when we look at painting. I just wanted to point out the use of color here, right? So, the tomato is really represents like the stain of hatred or slavery. And the red of the tomato, someone throwing that at a girl, really the color heightens that sense of like it could hit her and stain her, this white dress she's wearing. And the artist is playing with the white dress because it's really meant to symbolize innocence and purity. So, that's why I'm saying you kind of have to look at just sort of the painting on its own term, because in this case the artist is kind of playing around with subverting color and what maybe expectations, and but still making color and race the central part of the painting. So you can use white, like we saw with Martin Luther King, as a symbol of purity, because he represents a cause that is pure and noble, right? And the use of black as a color too is often adds a sense of mystery, and maybe has a different kind of feeling, a different tone. So of course, there's also the feeling component of color as well. Now, for me, I think both of these would be very bright to look at on a sunny day. So that would be an example of maybe choosing one color versus the other. If it's too dark, it might get too hot, and if you touch it, you might have a lawsuit, right? So there are other reasons why you might pick one versus the other. So going back to what we were talking about this week, these are both examples of naturalism, bringing a god to life in human form, right? So on the left, we see Neptune with a sort of naked body, and that's not meant to sexualize him, but to just sort of make him human. And of course, with Neptune, it makes sense too, because he's swimming in the ocean all the time, right? It makes sense that he would at least wear a speedo, but in this case the Greeks, they kept subjects nude, but it's a way of bringing the god to life. And you've got the best of both worlds. Got the old man with the beard with the young body, right? In the case of Aphrodite, again, you're sort of sensualizing her, but not sexualizing her. So she's really all about modesty and seduction and feeling like at ease with her own body. But of course, you have your cake and eat it too in both cases. So, we're going to keep talking about naturalism, but as we move forward, we're going to really look at how, conquest and politics and culture is all this sort of two-way street. And we're going to see how the Roman Empire starts gobbling up all this territory over time. And as a result, the Roman Empire becomes this sort of sum of all of its parts. So as Rome expands outward from its origin here on the Italian peninsula, it starts resembling Greece, because as it conquers Greece, or it conquers Turkey, or conquers the Parthian Empire, or Egypt, or Carthage, it starts absorbing those cultures to the point that Rome starts transforming within and begins to resemble all these places that it conquers. Just like the United States, we've got all kinds of cultures that contribute to everything from music to, buildings to art and other things, television. So, the United States is a very interesting analogy to the Roman Empire, because the idea is citizenship is what holds you together, or at least having that Roman identity. And you can see how huge Rome becomes. It's really a very impressive scale given the limitations of the ancient world in terms of, no electricity, no railroads, no airplanes. And yet they were able to keep it together because of, I think, the Mediterranean connecting everyone together, but also because they were taking advantage of all the resources and all the things that you can kind of share given such a vast territory. So I think that's probably a good place to end. Maybe I'll just show you briefly. This is the Arapace that Caesar Augustus builds after, or creates, or commissions after conquering the Egyptians. So he makes this as a celebration of his conquest. And this is a very big departure from the previous view of Rome, which is really what you see here on the left. That shows a wolf, a she wolf, suckling these two boys with her, wolf breasts. And those are Romulus and Remus, the two founding fathers of Rome. And I believe one killed the other to be the surviving, kind of like Cain and Abel. So Rome is named after Romulus after he kills his brother Remus. And that's the original founding myth of Rome. And then several centuries later, you get this other vision of Rome, still with the two children, but now there's no she-wolf. Now it's a very different Rome. So we sort of see a self-image, a kind of transformation from a very dangerous Rome that feels almost wild to a Rome that feels very prosperous, with nature completely in check and under control. And that's a very remarkable transition. And it doesn't mean that Rome isn't as violent as ever, but it's just they're going to do, very good. Someone wants to, if you are having trouble finding a sculpture from your hometown, you're welcome to write about any of the things we're seeing here. because the idea is just for you to start thinking about art and writing about it, at least in this case for naturalism. So I think that's probably, well, let me ask, just kind of get our intellects going. We'll end on this note. What does it mean to be domesticated, right? So, when we think about domestication, what would be a good operational kind of definition for domestication versus
From
being,
my knowledge,
what's that?
I was going to say, uh, there's actually like a difference between being tamed and domesticated.
Okay.
Taming is taking a wild animal and subduing it to human wishes, whereas domestication is an animal born already from two animals
That are
subdued. So,
tamed.
like,
Yeah.
you can tame a wild lion, but cows are domesticated because they have been around humans for a long amount of time.
Great, great.
You
So
know,
let me ask you a question. Are human beings, are we domesticated?
to
Well, exactly. It's like, so, we are part of nature, right? So where do we fit in the spectrum of domestication? Are we beyond the scope, are we beyond the definition because we are sort of exceptional? Or, from if you say a cow has been domesticated, what does it mean when you domesticate an animal? Can
in
they,
this case, yeah, in this case, it would be under the what's it called? The context of human domestication. But if something were to domesticate humans, that would be more along the lines of, I think, more of machinery or society
right. It's an
in
interesting
terms of
question, right?
domestication. Like when you're born into, let's say, when you're born in America, you're technically American, domesticated American, technically
Right.
speaking.
Right. And I think that kind of might veer into a little different definition of domestic, but still, I think you kind of understand the idea. We tend to think of ourselves apart from nature, right? But when you think about all the things we benefit from domesticating, like, animal, to you could say we've domesticated agriculture. I think that's not a bad use of the word, right? But we don't necessarily think of ourselves as we domesticate ourselves, right? So, would you say that we have domesticated human beings? Like, are we still wild? And what's the difference between a wild human being and a domesticated human being? Well, one thing I think about when I think, and I'm not, this is not sort of absolute anything, but just kind of us thinking it out loud. When I think of an animal that's domesticated or even tamed, um, it's kind of like you're removing its ability to survive on its own, right? It can no longer survive in the wild, depending on, whether it's tamed or domesticated. But it's almost like you're saying now it's dependent on human beings for survival. Is that more or less kind of getting to somewhat around the idea of domesticated? Well, if so, well, then maybe human beings, likewise, we are domesticated because we now depend on each other for survival. We can't just go to a desert island and build a fire and live long lives because we've lost that touch of that wild sense. And the point I'm just trying to make is that it seems like one part of civilization is to make human beings interdependent, right? And that's the power of Rome, is to kind of get rid of that wild side of humanity and bring us all under the fold of kind of what you might call domestication, right? Agriculture, prosperity, reliable, animal husbandry. And all these things are really important because, in the New World, in what's today Latin America and North America, there weren't really any beasts of burden except the llama in South America. So they didn't really have animal husbandry in the New World, in like Aztec culture, Maya culture. I think they had like Chihuahuas and a few other dogs, but there weren't any big beasts that they used to make agriculture. And that's not only means you're limited with agriculture, but also you don't have a lot of disease that we have because of animals and human beings living together. And that's inoculated us to a lot of the diseases that didn't that made the New World, people in the New World, more vulnerable to disease. So certainly animal husbandry, agriculture, and just generally the idea of domestication. That's kind of what I feel like I'm looking at on the right, versus the left. It feels very wild, like kids who are growing up in the wild, who are being raised by a wolf. On the right, it feels like Rome has finally conquered nature and is really showing an image of itself that's really in control of nature. And I think more than that, he's showing the two sides are meant to, it's really meant to be the Mediterranean all coming under one empire. So there's a lot of symbolism to the sculpture. And next week, we're going to look at kind of all the advances that take place in Rome as it goes from this sort of, as we see this kind of nature's relationship to humanity go from being this sort of distant, wild thing to a domesticated, subordinated kind of part of life. And that very much leads to prosperity and all the changes that you can have once you kind of satisfy those basic needs that we saw this last week. So I think that's probably a good place to end. I don't want to take too much of your time. Let you guys go off on your merry way for Friday, but we will have class again on Monday. And just make sure you turn in your homework Sunday night, and I'll probably have that graded by the end of the week. And your next homework will be due the following week on Sunday, so that will be pretty regular. And oh yeah, I said Monday we're going to look at Rome, but in fact we're going to look at some paintings from Central America on Monday, and then on Wednesday we'll get back to Rome. So you got your feet wet a little bit with Rome, and so we'll get back to that very interesting subject on Wednesday, and go deep into the history and architecture. And but we'll do that after we look at some very interesting paintings from the Maya culture in Yucatan and southern Mexico on Monday. Any questions? All right, good. Well, I think this worked out better than I thought it might, so I'm glad we were able to do this. And yeah, if there's no questions, I will see you guys on Monday in the classroom.